The failures of 1848 had dealt a demoralizing blow to liberals and radicals across the continent. However, in the wake of these upheavals, conservative powers came to realize that things could not remain as they were. In some respects, the revolutions were a wake-up call to the dangers that could ensue if certain expectations were not met. Conservatives came to accept the idea of constitutions, believing they would appease liberal sentiment. Restricted electoral franchises now became a norm, as did efforts to win over the middle classes. In this respect, illiberal states began to pursue modernizing and industrial policies. These programs aimed to win the support of the business and middle classes. They would also bring economic improvement and employment, thereby curbing the appeal of socialism. In essence, governments were abandoning their former reactionary postures adhered to since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. If they could not suppress liberalism and modernization, they could seek to co-opt it and press it into service. In many respects, the new Napoleonic parvenu, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, was a model for this new brand of conservatism. He ran a liberal government with the support of the peasantry and French elites. During the 1850s, he pursued an aggressive modernization program that saw national prosperity restored to France. He equally increased the power of the state, bringing into existence a bloated bureaucracy that oversaw security forces and a secret police force that monitored political opponents. A veritable army of civil servants and state functionaries extended down to the most local levels of society, transforming France into a quasi-authoritarian, yet nonetheless democratic state. Centralization, modernization, and liberalization. These became the chief characteristics of the post-1848 era, and by and large, the next 2 decades were relatively quiet ones marked by economic growth and stability. However, this did not mean that the old revolutionary forces had been completely suppressed. In fact, the 1850s and 1860s were a period of reflection and reassessment in certain respects. One that would see a rethinking of radical politics, and with it, Europe's revolutionary tradition. Unsurprisingly, the communist ideologue Karl Marx was going to play an important role in this reassessment. Marx had spent the 1848 revolution in Cologne, writing for a radical worker newspaper and organizing movements. When the German revolutions failed in 1849, Marx did what most intellectuals at this time did. He fled. He eventually ended up in London, a city that attracted a great deal of political exiles in the years after 1848. Defeated, although hardly beaten, he and Engels had hopes of re-establishing the old Communist League organized during the 1840s. Doing so, however, was going to be an uphill battle. For starters, old divisions were still present. Blanquists and neo-Jacobins continued to put their faith in immediate political revolution. As Marx saw it, this was simply another recipe for failure. The material and social conditions for revolution had to first be prepared. Spontaneous revolution would get radicals nowhere, he argued. Unable to rein in the radical firebrands, Marx turned to study and writing instead. The life of an exile was tough. Poverty, constant fighting among émigré circles, and eking out a living in a new country. All of this took a toll on Marx. These were his sleepless nights of exile, as he claimed. and they left him a broken man in many respects. However, by the beginning of the 1860s, Marx was again beginning to take an active interest in radical politics. It wasn't due to inspiration from radical intellectuals or even the promise of a coming revolution on the horizon that drew Marx back into politics. Inspiration came from an unlikely source: the English trade unionists active in London at this time. The London Trade Councils were a labor organization that promoted worker issues ranging from higher wages to reduction in work hours. These organizers were hardly die-hard radicals. However, radical intellectuals and political refugees in London did gravitate toward these organizations, seeing them as a possible vehicle for creating a broad revolutionary platform. In 1864, the Trade Council took the lead in creating the International Working Men's Association, the IWMA, a body with a central committee based in London, but responsive to the plight of international labor on the whole. Within a year, this organization would become known by its more general title, the International. Since the 1840s, Marx had been active in drawing together European workers and building relationships across national borders. The International appeared exactly the type of activism and organizational strategy he believed necessary for real revolutionary change. Although hardly enamored with trade unionism, Marx joined the association. Marx had a specific goal when it came to the International. In his view, the future revolution depended upon a class-conscious proletariat acting as a class for itself. What this entailed was the formation of a mass worker party, one that would ultimately be directed and led by workers. Marx was under no illusion that this party would first be set up by intellectuals and elites. However, in drawing workers to a party, in educating them in socialist ideas, or making them class-conscious, as Marx put it, the party would eventually bring socialists and the workers together, creating a cadre of leaders drawn from the working classes. The International was imagined as the instrument for this outcome. It would print up and distribute propaganda, it would organize and educate workers, it would draw together workers from across Europe and the world and unify them as a single class. This plan, however, relied upon one basic assumption. Marx's socialism had to become the socialism and program of the International. And from the start, this raised some issues. The International drew together an array of leftist groups, including trade unionists, Chartists, Blanquists, former Carbonarists, and radical nationalists from various European countries. All of these groups had their own agendas, and it was not unimaginable to believe that the old ideological feuds that had hamstrung the Communist League might easily be reignited. The French delegation sitting in the International made Marx especially nervous. Headed by French socialists like Henri Toulaine and Eugène Varlin, the faction was largely inspired by the ideas of French socialists, and in particular, the thinker Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. As it happened, Proudhon was one of Marx's erstwhile antagonists, dating back to his years in Paris. Originally a printer in the French countryside, Proudhon had become a major leftist thinker through his writings and political activities. During the 1840s, he spoke with Charles Fourier and Louis Blanc. He also met with Karl Marx, who initially invited him to participate in his Communist Correspondence League that he'd been setting up. However, both ideological and personal differences eventually led to harsh words between the two men, and by the late 1840s, the two were moving in different directions. As with his other rivals, Marx found Proudhon a utopian idealist who did not understand the dynamics of modern class struggle. Marx did not refrain from stating this in his reviews of Proudhon's books, and at times, these reviews got petty and mean. In a text remarking on the philosophy of poverty published in the 1840s, Proudhon had laid out many of his ideas on capitalist exploitation. In his review, Marx criticized the work, stating it only demonstrated a poverty of philosophy in his estimation. Yet with or without Marx's blessing, Proudhon remained deeply committed to socialist ideas. When the Revolution of 1848 erupted, he became directly involved in politics, and in the following years took up writing as a journalist. In principle, he agreed with men like Louis Blanc. He argued that workers needed to associate with one another if they were to free themselves of capitalist exploitation. In particular, mutual financial cooperation was essential. Workers needed to own their own factories and workshops. They needed to control the means of production. Mutualism became one of his guiding principles. This seemed in line with many of the socialist theories of the time. Yet Proudhon's thinking was distinct. In his book, What is Property, written in 1840, he went beyond mere socialist schemes of assisting workers and association. As Proudhon saw it, property was theft. In his view, to own property and make money from it was equivalent to stealing from another. Wealth and one's personal financial advancement was based upon exploitation, Proudhon contended. This was simply how the capitalist system was designed. Ownership stole the well-being, livelihood, and even dignity from those who worked. Proudhon valued human freedom, and in this respect, he was critical of anything that hindered man's natural liberties. More to the point, in Proudhon's eyes, it was the state that constituted the ultimate obstacle to this freedom. It was the state that set limits on the individual and enslaved him. As Proudhon stated, to be governed is to be watched, inspected, spied upon, directed, law-driven, numbered, regulated, enrolled, indoctrinated, preached at, and controlled. Rather than serving the greater good, government controlled and exploited the individual. For Proudhon, the most perfect of human societies required an absence of government altogether, a state of existence he referred to as anarchy. Anarchy did not necessarily entail complete chaos. Rather, it promised a vision of limited and localized government beneficial to all. Each city or town was capable of attending to its own affairs. In each community, workers would form associations and mutual cooperatives that would free them of the constraints of exploitation. Worker self-management, rather than state-owned industries or business firms run by financiers. This was the essence of freedom. It was not Proudhon's basic ideas that Marx opposed. It was his ahistorical understanding of social theory and his naive belief in a possible social harmony that he found distasteful. For Marx, Proudhon merely imagined a more equitable type of capitalism. He did not want to overthrow the capitalist system as such. For Proudhon's part, he found Marx too domineering. He acted like the apostle of a new religion, rather than a social activist, he railed. To Marx's dismay, the Proudhonists commanded a strong influence within the International. Marx was determined to diminish that influence and ensure that his conception of materialist social revolution predominated. To this end, he insisted upon drafting the preamble for the International Workingmen's Association, and more precisely, attended to drawing up the rules of membership. This was key. The Proudhonists sought two main things. The first was to structure the International as a federation of political parties and trade unions. This would guarantee that each party could pursue their own program and not sacrifice their independence. The second thing they wanted was exclusive worker membership in the organization. This proposal would have excluded intellectuals like Marx from participation and leave the Proudhonist faction, consisting mainly of artisans and trade workers, predominant. Marx shot down both of these in drafting the rules. In his plan, the General Council would serve as the chief organ of the International. Individual members would join branches or sections in their home country that would be subordinate to the General Council. Secondly, membership was not restricted to workers, but open to anybody who wanted to join. Through these measures, Marx managed to sideline his French adversaries. However, in doing so, he had to ally with reform-minded English trade unionists, a move that implied a certain amount of compromise. Over the next few years, Marx found himself persistently trying to convince parochial trade unionists to partake in the guerrilla fights between capitalism and labor and expand their horizons beyond the limited world of trade grievances. Despite these endless frustrations, though, Marx succeeded in establishing his revolutionary socialism within the International. In 1860, Marx had been a marginal and relatively obscure German émigré. By working with the International, however, he acquired notoriety. By the end of the decade, he had managed to promote his vision of class struggle and international worker revolution to a wider audience. For Marx, the International would seek to put an end to those divisive revolutionary sects and create a real organization of the working classes for struggle. Worker self-emancipation and direct political engagement. These were what Marx sought to promote. Revolution was no longer the preserve of an intellectual elite acting out some romantic revolutionary drama, according to Marx. It belonged to the self-aware cosmopolitan proletariat, driven by the forces of history. If Marx was focusing attention on the international revolution ahead, Alexander Herzen had different ideas. Herzen was a reform-minded Russian intellectual. In his youth, he had been fascinated by the French Revolution and insisted it provided a model for Russia to emulate. In the 1830s, Herzen associated with a group of thinkers labeled Westernizers, who contended that Russia's future lay in adopting European-style liberal and national reforms. His ideas didn't carry much favor with the conservative Tsar Nicholas. Nicholas favored autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality over French ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Given this political climate, Herzen found himself at odds with the regime. He was subject to persecution by the Tsar's secret police and subsequently sent into exile. In 1848, Herzen found himself in Italy just as the wave of revolutions was about to break. Without hesitation, he rushed to Paris to participate in what he believed was going to be the great political drama of his generation. However, in Paris, Herzen did not find the heroic people's army and barricades he imagined. The revolutionaries were disorganized, he complained. They squabbled for hours over the wording of declarations and then fought over whose name would appear first on the document. As all of this went on, conservatives were mounting their resistance and crushing the worker movements. This entire scenario was a disgrace, and as Herzen traveled to other countries that year, he found the same thing occurring everywhere. By 1849, any idealistic and romantic fantasies Herzen may have possessed were quickly unraveling. In 1851, he settled in London, and there started the Russian Free Press. It published Russian-language newspapers and other books that could not be printed in the conservative atmosphere of Tsarist Russia. His aim was to allow Russian intellectuals a voice, to give them a platform in which they could criticize the Tsarist regime and promote reformist and even radical ideas. However, these activities alone were not what made Herzen a central Russian intellectual. It was the ideas he was beginning to promote. 1848 had left Herzen disillusioned with the West. If he had once thought it could serve as a model for Russia, he no longer believed that this was the case. In fact, Herzen began speaking of young Russia in comparison to old Europe, taking note of what he believed made Russia unique. To many European observers, the Russian Empire was a backward, quasi-medieval power. It had an agrarian economy that supported the empire's entrenched feudal hierarchies. The Russian peasantry was bound to the land and provided cheap labor for the nobles. It was also a multi-ethnic empire, with Asiatic, Muslim, and nomadic peoples living within it. If the industrial nation-state was the model of modernity, Russia was far from this ideal. Yet for Herzen, this perceived backwardness could actually be promising. Over the 1840s and 1850s, Herzen increasingly came to identify with socialist ideas. Yet his brand of socialism was quite distinct. It was not Marxist. Russian agrarianism made it difficult to imagine an industrialized proletariat taking power in the country. In Russia, there existed no bourgeoisie or industrial working class. Nor did Herzen support a social welfare state advocated by men like Blanc in France either. For Herzen, Russia required a style of socialism tailored to its unique character and historical development. As Herzen saw it, the Russian peasantry had lived for centuries in accordance with values of collective work and local community. Farms were run for the entire village, while feudalism had discouraged ideas of individual ownership. In the world of the peasant, the village community was everything. In this model, Herzen saw a Russia untainted by the trappings of bourgeois industry. Russia was exempt from the social conflicts that were tearing European societies apart. The values of a socialist society, collective work, equality, and common ownership, were already there in the Russian peasant commune, or the Obshchina. In this respect, Russia had no need for Marxist laws of history. It did not need to go through an industrial age to arrive at socialism. It was already there in the traditions and customs of the people. This organic socialism simply needed to be actualized, either through reform or by overthrowing the oppressive Tsarist state. This is what Herzen meant when he spoke of young Russia. The communitarian values of the peasantry promised a natural form of socialism, one that was agrarian rather than industrial, one that was rooted in the collective village and countryside and not the cities. It was this style of agrarian socialism that was best suited for Russia. It blended the message of equality and liberation promoted under the French Revolution with Russia's own unique historical development. An exile living abroad, Herzen oddly became a Russian nationalist of sorts. He promoted an indigenous form of socialism, suggesting it might be Russia, rather than England or France, that was pointing the way to the future. Ideas of a quintessentially Russian brand of agrarian socialism became the basis for what became known as Narodnik Socialism, a populist and democratic platform that challenged autocracy and advocated for the emancipation of the peasants suffering under the yoke of an oppressive and exploitative Russian nobility. This vision relied on an idealized image of the Russian people, or the Narod, and these ideas struck a chord with members of the Russian intelligentsia. Most prominent among them was the journalist Nikolai Chernyshevsky, who in 1863 published a book entitled What is to be Done? In this novel, the main characters were young Russian activists motivated by desires to put their ideas into action. They socialized with the peasantry, adopted the peasants' moral values, and practiced gender equality within their ranks. Above all, these new people pledged themselves to the cause of Narodnik socialism. What's to be Done proved to be immensely popular with young Russian radicals. It inspired them to act. As Vladimir Ilyich Lenin would later claim, Chernyshevsky's book showed how revolutionaries ought to think and act. It taught them that revolutions must have a moral ethos as much as a political program. More to the point, Chernyshevsky's book, and the new focus on the Russian peasantry in general, was responding directly to changes taking place in Russian society during the 1860s. In 1855, Tsar Nicholas, the notorious conservative committed to upholding autocracy and the Orthodox faith, died. Taking his place was Alexander II, a reform-minded Tsar who surrounded himself with forward-looking nobles and advisors. Collectively, they believed that Russia must either modernize or perish, as they claimed. Taking the throne, the first issue Alexander sought to tackle was Russia's feudal institutions, one of the chief impediments to modernization. In 1857, a Committee of Peasant Affairs was established to draw up proposals. 4 years later, an emancipation decree officially abolished serfdom throughout Russia. Only 6 years in power, Alexander had fundamentally transformed the social and economic base of the empire, effacing the long-standing feudal institutions that had traditionally underpinned Russian society. The politics of emancipation were a thorny issue. The government refused to appropriate aristocratic estates and redistribute landholding. Peasants were emancipated, but they were not given land of their own. In fact, the newly emancipated were forced to pay back their old lords, essentially having to buy their freedom over the next 40 years. This decision drew criticism from liberals and radicals alike. They understood that emancipation without land would create a class of peasant farmers dependent upon their former feudal lords. Without the promise of land, the Emancipation Decree was toothless and changed little. Under these circumstances, young radicals came to believe a peasant revolution might be the only way of truly reforming Russian society. By the mid-1860s, student protesters were staging demonstrations. They published their own newspapers and drew up petitions demanding reform and an end to censorship. The government responded in characteristic fashion, banning student organizations and intensifying state surveillance in universities. Tsarist reform had its limits, and radicalism was not to be tolerated. Radicals were not deterred. Over the next decade, they formed secret organizations and movements to carry on their opposition. More striking, they acted out the populist program sketched by Chernyshevsky in What Is to Be Done. During the 1870s, students and young radicals began going to the people. They temporarily left the universities and traveled through the countryside to see this peasant socialism firsthand. Russian youth went to villages dressed like peasants and sought to enlist them in their cause. They talked to peasants about the ideas of agrarian socialism and rural organization. They spread their message of Narodnik socialism, preparing the ground for an uprising against the state. Narodniks showed their commitment to Chernyshevsky's ideas and became a model of his New People in action. A small faction headed by Nikolai Ishutin set up cooperatives, lived ascetic lifestyles, and worked to spread propaganda in the countryside. The cooperatives were intended to be models of worker association. Ishutin proved more radical than most and considered almost any means necessary to foment revolution against the state, including robbery and murder to obtain money. In 1866, a member of Ishutin's group attempted to assassinate the Tsar, resulting in a crackdown on the faction. As expected, radicals were driven underground and began to engage in a secret war with the Tsarist police. However, the general Narodnik movement also suffered from dwindling momentum as the years went on. Student populism had always been mixed with a certain elitism. Students believed themselves more educated and forward-looking than peasants. They came to the countryside with the intention of educating and instructing the peasantry in socialism. For their part, Russian peasants found this lecturing too abstract and expressed suspicion of these urban elites dressed in traditional and highly stylized peasant costumes. In reality, peasants cared about issues of land and resources. They had little interest in or need for political theory. It wasn't too long before student activists gave up in frustration. The peasants were stubborn and stuck in their ways, they concluded. Nothing progressive could be expected from such a backward group. This, however, did not mean that the Narodnik movement was a complete failure. Its goals and ideas would have a long afterlife, even as many Russian intellectuals began to turn toward movements like Marxism. In the broader picture, Russian thinkers were coming to consider new forms of radicalism and new types of movements, and this was on par with some of the general changes taking place across Europe during this period. After the revolutions of 1848, radicals were rethinking their approaches and goals. They were questioning the old Jacobin legacy of the French Revolution and considering other alternatives. Whether this was the cosmopolitan proletarian revolution prophesied by Marx, the reworked Russian nationalism of Herzen, or the anarchism of Proudhon, new ideas were taking shape throughout the 1860s as thinkers and exiles reconsidered the contours of Europe's revolutionary tradition.